Adah Vane kept the telegraph key at a lonely water stop on the desert line and took the wire by herself in the dark. And the respectable side of the little settlement had decided she was no decent woman for it, when the truth was that she was a widow doing the one honest thing left to her. She did not know yet that before the first hard frost, a near-silent man who dug wells for his bread, a man she had given water to and scarcely spoken to, would put his own name beside hers against the whole company and change the entire shape of her life. It had begun the way the hard turns of a life so often do, with a thing she did not choose. Her husband, Tom Vane, had been the company operator at the stop, a gentle, careful man who loved the wire the way some men love a fiddle. And through 3 winters in that dry lamplit office, he had taught her the code letter by letter, until she could read the singing of the sounder as plain as speech. Then a lung fever settled in Tom's chest one drought winter and would not leave, and one cold gray morning he was simply gone, and Adah sat the key alone with the wire still humming as though the world had not ended. She buried him on the rise behind the tank, and because she could work the key as well as any man the line had ever sent, the division gave her leave to hold the post through the winter, and she kept the orders and the relay traffic and the trains running safe past a stop that had no one else to keep them. And the respectable side of the settlement, the side with the painted houses and the church and the postmaster's wife at the head of it, looked at a young widow sitting a man's post alone, tapping in the dark with strange operators down the line at every hour of the night, and decided by supper of her first week alone exactly what that made her. The word went round the way the worst words always do. Quiet and certain and impossible to answer. That it was not natural, not decent. A woman shut up nights with the wire and men she could not see, and Adah Vane, who had done nothing she was ashamed of, became a thing the decent wives lowered their voices about and drew their skirts past on the platform. Here is the thing the settlement had not troubled to learn about the woman it had so much to say about. Adah was not a soft girl who had drifted into a man's place by accident. She was 25, raised on a hard, dry homestead by a father who had no boys, and so taught his girl to do a man's work, and she had never been any good at being decorative. She had the one thing of Tom's worth keeping, his old brass telegraph key on its little varnished base. The key he had courted her on by tapping foolish things across the office when the line was quiet, and she kept it in a felt-lined wooden box and used it every day. The clean, quick song of it under her hand, the long and short of the sounder answering down the wire, was the one thing in that whole dry, lonely place that still sounded like Tom, and like home, and none of it would matter, because the drought meant to finish what the gossip had started. 3 years without a proper rain had drawn the depot's own well down and down until it came up alkali and foul, white-scummed and bitter, fit for nothing. And a water stop that cannot water its engines is no stop at all. The water train hauled good water out now from 40 miles up the line, Deer and Seldom, and the settlement was drying up around her, families loading wagons. Adah understood, listening to the dry wind worry the office door, that when the company decided the stop was not worth the hauling, the first thing they would pull was the key, and the first person they would put off the line was the lone woman holding it. I have been keeping this hearth a long while now, telling the slow stories, the ones where nobody is rescued by luck or by a fortune dropping out of a clear sky, but only by the stubborn daily choosing to do the next right thing with whatever drought you have been handed. And if that is the kind of story that keeps you good company of an evening, then pull your chair up close and stay with me, because Adah is about to learn the thing this whole channel keeps circling back to, that the people a town is quickest to whisper about are so often the very ones with the least to be ashamed of, and that it sometimes takes one silent, unlikely soul, passing through the dry edge of the world, to see a person plain, when the whole settlement has already decided not to. The silent soul who would see her plain was an itinerant well-digger named Eli Brandt, the closest mouthed fellow ever to come down that road. He went stop to stop along the dry line, sinking and cleaning wells for whatever a place could pay. Slow, patient underground work that wanted a man who could be alone at the bottom of a shaft all day and not mind it. He had come west years before with a wife, and lost her to the same dry country their first hard summer, and had not married again nor wished to, and had got so far out of the habit of company that the people he worked for took his silence for sourness, the way people do. But Eli Brandt had eyes, and what they had been telling him since he rode in to look at the dying well was that the lady operator of the settlement had decided to scorn, carried herself with more plain dignity than any of the women who scorned her. He saw her work the key from dark to dark and walk to the office through talk that would have bowed a weaker back, and never once let the settlement see her flinch, as though their contempt were a kind of dry weather she had decided not to feel. And he understood, the way a quiet man understands everything before she let herself understand it, that the company did not mean to fight the drought. They meant to cut the stop loose, pull the key, and put the friendless widow off the line. And call it nothing but business. If you've made it this far into Adah's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. It was a dry evening late in the fall when the thing came to a head. The division man came out on the water train, a man named Garrett Hale, who wore a clean town coat at a stop full of dust, and told her, with the office door open and whoever cared to hear it, that the stop could not pay its water and the company meant to close the office at the new year. A married operator might have been carried to the next post, he said, but the company would not move a lone woman down the line and answer for it, and so the key would be pulled, and she put off. He was sorry. He was the kind of man who is always sorry. And Adah stood in the little office that was the last of the life she and Tom had built, the brass key gone quiet on the table behind her, and she did not beg, because she had learned from a hard father that begging only feeds the kind of man who comes to watch you do it. But she felt the cold go all the way through her, because she had no answer and nowhere to go. Eli Brandt was there. He had come up to the office at the end of the day to tell her what he had found at the bottom of the well, and he stood off in the dusk by the water tank and heard the whole of it, and something in his quiet face had gone very still and very hard. He said nothing while Hale talked. He waited until the division man had tipped his clean hat and gone back to the warm car, and then he came up onto the platform and took off his hat and turned it in his big, careful hands, and said to Adah Vane the longest thing he had said to anyone in years. He said he knew it was not his place, but he had heard what they meant to do, and it was not right, a thing she had not done, being a woman. And being alone, costing her the post and the name she had kept clean through all of it. And then he said there was one way to stop them. If she could stand the idea, the company would pull the key on a lone woman and call it nothing, but it had as good as said it would carry a married operator on, and the talk that called her improper had nothing left to say about a married woman keeping the wire in her own home. If she would let him marry her on paper, plain and quiet before the frost, the division man's whole easy reason came apart in his hands. He would take a cot in the freight room and ask nothing of her she did not freely give. She would keep her key and her post and her wage and her own self entire. He made the whole speech to the brim of his hat and not to her face, because he could not have made it any other way. Adah did not answer that night. She lay awake on her cot with the dry wind worrying the office and turned it over. But she understood what he had truly offered, which was not himself, but her own good name and her own livelihood handed back to her, the very things the company and the gossip had set out to take, and he had offered it without once making her feel small, without the pity that was worse than the whispering, as if it were a plain matter of justice and not of charity. In the gray morning she sat to the key and answered the first call down the line clean and sure, the way Tom had taught her, and when Eli came up for the day's work she told him, steady, that she would take his name through the winter and be grateful, and the corner of his mouth moved, which on him, she would learn, was very nearly a smile. They were married 4 days later by the settlement circuit preacher on the platform in the lee of the depot, with 2 of the section men for witnesses and the dry wind off the desert for music. There was no ring and no kiss. Because that was not what this was, Eli said the words low, looking at the rail, and Adah said hers looking out at the single wire running off, humming into the brown distance. That night Adah slept in her back room a married woman, and Eli slept on the freight room cot a married man, and the brass key sat in its box on the office table in the dark. And neither of them yet knew what they had begun. The hard turn of that dry autumn into winter was the slow making of them. The cold came down on the desert nights bitter and clear, and there was nowhere much to be but at the work of keeping the stop alive and the wire open. And though Eli kept faithfully to the freight room and asked her for nothing. A paper marriage has a way of leaking into the daylight whether 2 people will or no. He went back down into the foul well day after day where no one had asked him to, and set the office door true on its dragging hinge, all without a word. And she saw all of it. Saw that the silent man did for her in the only language he had, the language of dug and mended things, and began. Without quite deciding to do for him in return, kept a plate warm for whatever hour he climbed up out of the ground, and washed the well mud from his one good shirt last and best, and learned the sound of his step on the platform. And the talk, between 2 people who had married to stop talk, came slow and then easier, the way a dry pump comes when you work it. She found he was not silent, because he had nothing to say, but because he had spent years with no one worth saying it to, and that if she went on with the wire and did not press him, the words came on their own, low at the edge of the lamplight, dry and once in a while very nearly funny. He told her a piece at a time about the wife he had lost and the homestead he had meant to make her and never did, and Adah did not try to fix any of it, only let him set it down where another soul could see it. They did not name what was happening. But the dry, lonely stop had stopped being a place she merely endured, and they both felt the change and were afraid of it. Because a thing built to last one winter has no business growing roots. It was the old brass key that opened the way through. One still, cold night, with the line quiet, Adah took the key out of its box to clean the contacts and oil the pivot against the dry, the way Tom had taught her, and lifted the felt pad from under the lid to wipe the box clean, and this time, tucked beneath the felt where the lid seated, she found a square of paper gone soft and brown at the creases, with her own name on the front in Tom's careful operator's hand. The hand was the unsteady hand of his last sick winter, and Adah understood that Tom had written it knowing the fever might not let him go, and hidden it in the one thing he knew she would keep and use and one day take apart to care for, and never said a word. She sat down at the office table in the cold lamplight and read it. Tom had written that the great fear of his dying was not the dying, but the worry that his good, strong girl would take holding the post and keeping his memory for the whole of what was left her, and would spend her life shut up with the wire and her chin up and her heart closed, asking nothing of anybody because she had been taught too young to do without. The key will sing for you and the wire will keep you company, he had written, but a sounder cannot put its arms around you, and I did not love you only to leave you a job. And then, at the very last, in a line that must have cost the sick man the final of his strength, Do not let your pride or their hard words keep you from being loved when the time comes. When a good soul sees the whole of you and does not look away, let him. That is the one thing I want for you still. Now I cannot give it to you myself. Live, Adah, be warm." She wept then, the way she had not let herself weep since the cold morning she lost him, alone at the table with her husband's last kindness open under the lamp. Tom had not spent his dying breath asking her to keep his post or guard his memory. He had spent it begging her to set the weight down and let herself be held, and naming, before he knew there would be one, the very kind of good soul who might one day come. The next morning, when Eli came up stamping the cold off his boots and she handed him his coffee, she let her hand rest against his on the warm tin cup a moment longer than she ever had, and did not pull it away, and he looked down at her hand and then up at her face and did not say one word, and everything was said. Then the worst of the winter came down on the line, and with it the reckoning Adah had been bracing for, though it did not come the way she had feared. A freight made up wrong up the division was running heavy and late on the single track in a hard night wind. The dispatcher far down the line had lost it, and a passenger train was due against it on the same iron with no siding between but the dying stop. Adah read the danger off the wire before any of them. The orders crossed. The meat gone bad. 2 trains set to find each other in the dark. And the office where she sat alone was the one place on 40 miles of track that could stop it. She broke in on the wire and held the circuit and tapped it out clean and fast. "Hold the eastbound. Hold him here. The meat is wrong." Tom's code under her hand steadier than her heart, and down the singing wire the answer came, and the heavy freight ground to a stand on the dark grade above the stop. And the passenger train held, and 2 trainloads of souls went home that did not know how near they had come, because a lone woman the settlement called improper had kept her head and kept the wire, and Eli was with her in it. When she broke in on the line he had run for the lanterns without being told and gone out into the wind to throw the stops one short spur and flag the grade. The 2 of them working the dark emergency like a thing long practiced, and when it was over and both trains safe, they stood together on the platform with their breath smoking and the wire gone quiet, and did not say anything at all, and did not need to. So when the new year came on, and Garrett Hale rode out on the water train to finish the business, a closing order in his hand. Meaning to pull the key and shut the office now the stop was as good as dead, he found he had walked into the wrong settlement. He had not been there the night of the crossed orders. He did not know what the winter had made. He stood in the office door and began on the closing in his smooth, sorry voice, and before he was well started, the people began to come. Up from the dwindled settlement and in off the section gang, the families she had kept safe, and the trainmen who had heard down the line who held the eastbound that bad night, and they stood around that little office in the cold and made it immovably plain that the company was pulling no key and putting nobody off any line. And Eli Brandt had brought a thing of his own. He had gone down into the foul alkali well one last time and dug through to good water at the bottom, sweet cold water, more than the stop had seen in 3 dry years, and he held a brimming dipper of it out to the division man, and told him, in more words than the settlement had ever heard him string together, that the stop could water its engines again. And there was no longer one honest reason on this earth to close it or pull the key from the only operator who had never once failed the line. There was no shouting and no triumph in it. The people simply stood for their own, and the division man who had come to close an office on a friendless widow found himself answered instead, the good water cold in the dipper. The crossed order night on every tongue, and 40 plain witnesses between him and the woman he had come to unseat. Garrett Hale tried once or twice at the smooth words that had always served him, found there was no room left at that stop for them, and rode back up the line. When word of the night she saved the meat, and the morning Eli struck water worked up the division, the company found it had no wish to close a stop that watered again, and kept the train safe better than most. And the closing order was burned, and Adah Vane kept her key. Eli Brandt had stood at the back of that crowd with his hat in his hands, and when it was over he crossed the dusty platform to stand at Adah's side where the whole settlement could see him do it, the first time he had ever put himself plainly beside her in front of anyone. He did not make a speech. That was not his way. He only said low, but not so low that the nearest could not hear it, that he had told her in the fall he would set her free in the spring, and that he had found he was a liar, because he had no wish on this earth to be free of her, and that if she would have him for true, and not for any paper got up against a railroad, he would count it the great good fortune of his life. And Adah Vane, who had made her peace with a quiet key and being of use to people who would not say her name, looked at the silent man who had seen the whole of her through a long, hard winter and never once looked away, heard her husband's last letter in her own ears, and did not make him ask her twice. They were married again in the early spring, for true this time. When the rains had come back at last, and the desert had gone green, and the stop had filled up again with life, they stood up together in the little settlement church that had drawn its skirts past her only a season before, with the section men and the trainmen crowded into the back in their good clothes, and a few of the respectable wives near the front, looking a shade ashamed of themselves. As well they might. The circuit preacher who had married them on the platform said the words right at last, with the spring light coming through the glass. And that bright morning, when the office was quiet, Adah let her hand fall to the old brass key out of long habit, and tapped, soft and just for herself, the one short word Tom had taught her first of all the code. The word that means the message is received and understood, because the worn brass thing that had been the one sound of home through every lonely season had earned its place at that wedding as much as anyone in the room. She had come to the desert line an operator's wife, and been left a widow with a man's post and a stolen name. Certain the best of her life lay buried on the rise behind the tank with Tom. She grew old at that stop that became a town when the water came back, beside the quiet man who put his name beside hers when no one else would, and in time the lonely little office gave way to a proper depot with her name in the company book as the operator who never lost a train. And the wives who had once drawn their skirts past her brought their telegrams to her counter and were glad of her. The old brass key sat on the desk in the warm by then, worn smoother than ever, beside a newer key the line had sent, waiting for the young woman come to learn the code at the famous operator's elbow, and on the last evening of this story the two of them caught the low gold light through the office glass, the old worn one and the new. A name, it turns out, is the smallest part of what a person is worth, and the cruelest thing a town can do is decide who you are before it is troubled to know you. So here is what I will leave you with tonight, friend, before the lamp burns low, when the world has hung a name on you that you did not earn. Do you let your pride and their hard words keep you small and alone? Or do you trust the right soul to see the whole of you in the dry season and stand beside you in the green one? Tell me which one you would have chosen, and pull your chair up to the hearth again soon.